ado, I'm the CU Compliance Connection by League Info Site, here to bring you the Compliance Outlook for a review of a few laws and regulations that are impacting credit unions in the second and third quarter of 2017. We'll start off the second quarter talking about the Department of Labor's Fiduciary Rule that became effective on June 9th this year. While there are some parts of the rule pertaining to exemptions that are not effective until January 1st of 2018, credit unions should still be aware of the provisions that become effective at the beginning of June. Moving to the third quarter, we have some big changes coming up. First, we will discuss Phase 2 of NACHA's same-day ACH that credit unions will need to implement in September. And then we will touch base on the changes to the Military Lending Act related to credit cards and on the calculation of the military annual percentage rate that became effective in October. Lastly, we will discuss the first changes related to the CFPB's mortgage servicing rules that become effective in October. There are actually quite a few changes that become effective, so we'll just be providing an overview in this video, but please stay tuned for another Compliance Connection video focusing specifically on these mortgage servicing changes. There seems to be quite a bit of confusion related to the Department of Labor's Fiduciary Rule amendments. So in this video, we are hoping to be able to summarize the rule in an easy way so credit unions can determine if these amendments apply to them and can move forward with either adjusting their procedures or working with a broker-dealer or legal counsel to develop a contract exemption. First and foremost, the revised rule requires that all financial institutions, including credit unions, give investment advice concerning investment retirement accounts, or IRAs, and IRSA retirement plans that are in the best interest of the retirement investor. That means that the advice must meet a professional standard of care, must be based on the interests of the customer, charges can be no more than reasonable compensation, and there can be no misleading statements about investment transactions, compensation, and conflicts of interest. These are considered to be impartial conduct standards, and credit unions are required to comply with these provisions on the effective date of June 9th, 2017. Now, in May 2017, the Department of Labor released a new set of frequently asked questions that provided for a phased-in approach for some of the exemptions that credit unions may rely on. So now, let's break down the rule for the two types of activities that credit unions are involved in that may require additional documentation to meet an exemption under the rule. First, credit unions who have IRA term deposits at their credit union need to evaluate their recommendations and compensation structure associated with these accounts. If, for example, a credit union makes recommendations to members on IRA accounts regarding rollovers, transfers, or distributions, and because it's a two-pronged test, they also receive direct or indirect compensation in connection with that transaction, the credit union should either explore an exemption under the rules or eliminate one of those prongs. Otherwise, it may be considered a prohibited transaction under the rules. Remember, in order for a transaction to be covered, the credit union has to provide both the investment recommendation and receive compensation. Coverage can be avoided by eliminating one of those activities. Additionally, credit unions who refer members to a third-party broker-dealer and receive associated compensation with that referral should be working with the broker-dealer to ensure they are compliant with the new rule and determine if a best interest contract exemption may be necessary. In summary, the credit union should look at the advice they provide or that a broker-dealer provides and their corresponding compensation structure in order to avoid prohibited transactions or utilize an exemption such as the best interest contract exemption. Moving right along to the third quarter is Phase 2 of the NACHA rules pertaining to same-day ACH. If you remember last September, receiving depository financial institutions, or RDFIs, were required to accept same-day ACH credits. Now, this September, RDFIs are required to accept same-day ACH credits and debits by the end of their processing day. Also, be prepared because in March of 2018, credit unions will be required to process same-day ACH credits and debits by 5 p.m. local time. So as of this September, credit unions have until the end of their processing day, whenever that may be, to process the same day debits and credits. But in March, they should be prepared to have them processed by 5 p.m. local time for the RDFI. Here is a really nice chart that Nacha provided that summarizes the changes and the associated processing deadlines and effective dates. Effective on October 3rd, credit unions will need to calculate the military annual percentage rate, or MAPR, for covered borrowers who have credit cards. In this calculation, credit unions can exclude fees from the MAPR calculation that are bona fide and reasonable. So now, credit unions are going to need to determine if their fees meet the bona fide and reasonable standard. Keep in mind that credit insurance premiums or fees and fees for ancillary products will need to be calculated in that MAPR calculation. They do not have an exemption. So in order to determine if a fee is reasonable, the credit union should use the safe harbor provided. The safe harbor indicates that a fee is reasonable if the amount of the fee is less than or equal to an average amount of a fee for the same or substantially similar product or service. Okay, that part makes sense. Now, who are we going to be comparing that fee to? Credit unions will need to look at 5 or more creditors, each of whose U.S. credit cards in force is at least $3 billion in an outstanding balance at any time during the 3-year period preceding the time the average is computed. So, credit unions will need to take a look at their fees and compare them to the average fees charged by at least 5 creditors whose portfolio was at least $3 billion in the preceding 3 years for the safe harbor. For the safe harbor, the credit union's fees should be less than or equal to those fees being compared. Credit unions can access credit card agreements from the CFPB's website. These agreements will contain details on the fees charged by those creditors. Credit unions should utilize this when comparing their fees and maintain associated documentation for ensuring their reasonableness under the safe harbor. What's the importance of making this determination? If one fee is considered unreasonable, all of the fees will need to be included in the MAPR calculation. All right, let's start digging into the mortgage servicing rules that become effective in October of this year. Remember, there are quite a few changes to the mortgage servicing rules. The first set of changes becomes effective on October 19th of this year. The second set of changes becomes effective on April 1st of 2018. We're only going to provide an overview on the changes that become effective this year in October. First and foremost, credit unions will need to update their policies and procedures for evaluating loss mitigation applications to include the requirement to promptly identify and obtain documents or information not in the borrower's control if the credit union is requiring that information for loss mitigation options. In general, the credit union will need to conduct reasonable due diligence in order to obtain the documents or information being requested and will be prohibited from denying an otherwise complete loss mitigation application because the credit union lacks that documentation or information, unless, of course, they meet certain conditions. Before a credit union charges a borrower for force-placed insurance, the credit union is required to provide certain notices to the borrower. Effective in October, those notices will need to be revised. The model language is being revised to include a reference not only for situations where coverage has expired, but for insufficient coverage as well. The timing requirements still apply for the reminder notices, which require the initial written notice to be provided at least 45 days before assessing a fee, then again after 30 days or 15 days before implementing the fee. Credit unions are encouraged to use the model language within the regulation to meet those notice requirements. The amended rules require the credit union to make good faith efforts to establish live contact again no later than the 36 days after each payment due date, as long as the borrower remains delinquent. Similar changes were also made to the written notice requirements that require a credit union to provide a delinquent borrower with written notice no later than the 45th day of the borrower's delinquency. Amendments now require the credit union to provide notice again no later than 45 days after each payment due date, as long as the borrower remains delinquent. Credit unions will want to make sure they update their procedures and their processes to reflect these changes. Now, there is a partial exemption to the early intervention live contact requirements when either a borrower on a mortgage loan is a debtor in bankruptcy or when the credit union is a debt collector under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the FDCPA, and the borrower has provided notification under the rule. A credit union would also be exempt from the written notice requirements if there were no loss mitigation options available. However, if there are any loss mitigation options available and either of those two conditions are met, either a debtor in bankruptcy or invoked protections under the FDCPA, the servicer must comply with the modified written notice requirements for the mortgage loan. That means that the written notice cannot contain a request for payment, and the credit union is not required to provide the written notice more than once during a single bankruptcy case. Keep in mind, if the member is both a debtor in bankruptcy and invoked protections under the FDCPA, the servicer is exempt from the written notice requirements. If you have a borrower that was previously exempt from the notification requirements because they were a debtor in bankruptcy, the credit union is required to resume compliance after the next payment due date that follows the earliest event. The bankruptcy case is dismissed, the bankruptcy case is closed, or the borrower reaffirms personal liability for the mortgage loan. The credit union is not required to resume compliance with the live contact early intervention requirements if the borrower has discharged personal liability on a mortgage loan pursuant to Chapter 7, 11, 12, and 13 of the Bankruptcy Code. However, for the written notice requirements, the credit union must resume compliance if the borrower has made any partial or periodic payment on the mortgage loan after commencement of the borrower's bankruptcy case. There were also changes made impacting the required loss mitigation procedures. Again, we are only touching on them briefly here, so credit unions are encouraged to conduct further research to make sure that they are compliant come October. One of the changes was the ability for the servicer to offer a short-term payment forbearance program or a short-term repayment plan to a borrower based on an evaluation of an incomplete loss mitigation option or application. There are certain notice requirements that the servicer must provide when offering one of these programs to borrowers, such as the evaluation was conducted based on an incomplete application, and other loss mitigation options may be available. There were also changes made to the written notice that is required to be sent to the borrower after receiving a complete loss mitigation application. Lastly, related to loss mitigation procedures, there were changes related to mortgage loans where servicing is transferred. So, if the credit union is acquiring servicing rights, the credit union must comply with the loss mitigation rules that apply to that loan prior to the transfer and within the timeframes that were applicable to that servicer that transferred the loan. The last change we will discuss regarding the mortgage servicing rules are the changes for periodic statements if a loan has been charged off. The amended rules indicate that a servicer is exempt from the periodic statement requirements if the loan has been charged off in accordance with loan loss provisions, and the credit union will not charge any additional fees or interest on the loan. Additionally, the credit union has to provide the notice indicated on the screen within 30 days of charge off or on the most recent periodic statement. There are also a significant amount of changes that will take place in April related to the periodic statement requirements for borrowers in bankruptcy. So stay tuned for those changes and many more related to the determination and treatment of successors and interest. As usual, lots of changes that credit unions need to prepare for. We hope this review was helpful, and we thank you for joining us at the CU Compliance Connection. Be sure to stay tuned for future podcasts on issues that affect your credit union. We are here to help you at the CU Compliance Connection by League Info site.